The integumentary system, or the skin, is the largest organ of the body. It has many functions that contribute to helping the body function properly, such as recognizing the sensation of touch, producing vitamin D, temperature regulation, and overall protection of the exterior surface of the body. These important functions are rooted in the skin's layers. There are actually 2 layers of the skin, despite what people will lead you to believe. There's epidermis and the dermis, and then that third not-so layer is called the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. So we're going to work our way from the outside in, starting with the epidermis. Now, when you think of skin, the epidermis is probably the first thing that comes to mind. This is because we're constantly seeing it, we're constantly manipulating it, it's right there. The epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. That is the part that we can touch and feel. This layer also gives us our skin color. This layer is made up of keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue, so it's multiple layers of flat cells that are piled up on top of each other. This tissue is specifically for protecting the exposed surfaces of the body, and the epidermis is mostly made up of dead skin cells, which is what keratinized means. However, there are skin cells in the deepest layer of the epidermis, the stratum basale, that are constantly dividing in order to replenish those dead skin cells on the surface that are continuously being shed. The next layer is the dermis, which holds majority of the accessory structures that help the skin with its primary functions. This sits underneath the dermis and is separated by the epidermal ridge. The dermis is organized into 2 distinct parts, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is a thin layer that is on the other side of the epidermal ridge. This layer holds sensory receptors that allow us to feel the sensation of touch. The sensory receptors are these cone-like figures right here. The papillary layer is made up of areolar tissue, which is really rich in blood cells, as you can see by these veins and arteries that flow up to the dermis side of the epidermal ridge. Then we have the reticular layer, which is much thicker than the former papillary. Here is where the hair follicles, which assist the skin in its functions, sweat glands, which help with temperature regulation, sebaceous glands, which help moisturize the skin and protect against friction, and more sensory receptors and more veins and arteries hang out. The reticular layer is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue due to it being jam-packed with collagen and elastin fibers. Lastly, we have that not-so layer, the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. The hypodermis is located deep within the dermis and is actually made up of adipose tissue. So that's why we see these swollen, bulbous cells at the base of the dermis. The main purpose of the hypodermis is for energy storage and to act as cushion, kind of like your butt when you sit in a chair. Next, we're going to talk about the structure of the skull and how it protects our brain. So first, we have the frontal bone, which is the largest and most superior bone visible at the front of the skull, and it makes up most of the forehead. You can see that it has very large openings for the eyes, and this protects our frontal lobe. Then, after the frontal bone, we have our nasal bone. It's actually a pair of bones, so that means 2. And these bones form the nose bridge. This is what we feel when we press on our nose. Then we have the maxilla, which forms the upper jaw, and it has these sockets that are able to support our teeth. So another part in that whole jaw portion is the palatine bone. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but this is the part that's like a palate expander when you go to the dentist. So after the palatine bone, the zygomatic bone, which is lateral to the maxilla. They are our quote-unquote cheek bones. And then after we have that, we have the mandible, which forms our lower jaw. This also has sockets to support our teeth, just like our maxilla, aka our upper jaw. Then we have our lacrimal bone, which is visible on the medial wall of the orbit. It also includes the lacrimal groove. It's this little bit that's like really stuck inside that eye socket. It's not really visible in this view of the skull. But we also have the ethmoid bone, which can be seen posterior to the lacrimal bone. It's that little bit that's peeking out there. And then after that, we have the sphenoid bone, which forms most near the rear orbit. It's kind of like at the temple, but not really. And then we have the parietal bone, which is the largest bone visibly lateral, which is that whole big portion. And then moving on, we have our nose bones. So they're one bone, which is the vomer bone. This blue part right here. It is the most inferior portion of the septum. So like, let's go back to our other view of the skull. Like if you were to draw out the whole nose, that bit right there at the bottom between the two nostrils, that bone. And then moving on to the posterior view of the skull, we have our occipital bone, which is this blue, this light blue part right here. It's kind of like this bean shape, I like to think of it as. It is the posterior of the skull. It kind of hugs that back portion of our brain. And then we have the lambdoid suture, which kind of joins the occipital bone to the parietal bones, which is very important. It keeps, the skull in one solid structure, even though there are multiple parts. Then we have the external occipital protuberance, which is like this sort of bump that's in the middle of the occipital bone. It's in the name protuberance, so it does indeed protrude. And then we have the superior and inferior neutral lines, which extend laterally from external occipital protuberance. You can see like these very faint lines that I'm highlighting right here. And then going back to the palatine bone from before, like I said, this is indeed a part of the jaw. It's kind of that inner part, like when you go to the dentist and they give you like a palate expander, it goes in there. It's in like the maxilla, the upper part of the jaw. And then after that, we're going to move into more sutures. So we have the sagittal suture, which joins the right and left parietal bones, as you can see right here. It's like right down the middle of the posterior view of the skull, or rather like the top view of the skull. And then we have the coronal suture, which joins the parietal bones to the frontal bone. It runs along the coronal / frontal line of the skull, as you can see right here. It's like right separating right where that forehead kind of ends. Then we have the squamous suture, which joins the parietal bone together. You can see it right here. And then we have the lambdoid suture, which joins the occipital bone to the parietal bones. And it's right where I highlighted.